Money makes people do crazy things. But sometimes it's not the people with money who surprise you. It's the ones without it. Picture this. A man worth $3 billion sits in an expensive restaurant, completely unaware that four strangers across the room are planning to destroy his life. They've studied his schedule for months. They know exactly when he leaves, which car he drives, and how many bodyguards he travels with. Tonight is the night they've been waiting for. But here's what they didn't plan for a 28-year-old waiter named Marcus Thompson, who works 2 jobs to support his 6-year-old daughter, and a quiet businessman named David Chun, who's been watching everything unfold from the corner booth. Sometimes the people you'd never suspect become the heroes in stories that sound too incredible to be true. Sometimes a single decision made by an ordinary person changes the course of multiple lives forever. And sometimes the most dangerous criminals make one critical mistake. They underestimate the power of human decency. This is one of those stories. A story about greed, desperation, and the unexpected courage of 2 men who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. A story that proves heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear aprons and carry serving trays. What you're about to read actually happened. The names have been changed, but every detail, every conversation, and every heart-stopping moment is real. By the time you finish reading, you'll understand why this story made headlines around the world and why Marcus Thompson and David Chun became symbols of something much bigger than themselves. It all started on a Tuesday evening in Manhattan, when 4 desperate men thought they had planned the perfect crime. Marcus Thompson wiped down the marble table for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, his eyes scanning the elegant dining room of Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. The soft lighting reflected off crystal glasses and gold-rimmed plates, creating an atmosphere that screamed money. Marcus had been working here for 8 months now, and he still felt out of place among the wealthy clientele who thought nothing of spending his monthly rent on a single dinner. Tonight felt different somehow. There was a tension in the air that Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was because his daughter Sophia had been running a fever that morning, and his ex-wife Jessica had called twice asking when he'd be home. Maybe it was the stack of unpaid bills sitting on his kitchen counter, growing taller each week despite his best efforts to work extra shifts. Marcus glanced at his watch. 7:15. His shift was supposed to end at 9, but Chef Laurent had already hinted that they might need him to stay late for a private party. That would mean getting home after midnight again, missing another bedtime story with Sophia. The guilt gnawed at him, but the overtime pay was too good to pass up. At table 12, 4 men in expensive suits sat huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Marcus had served them appetizers an hour ago, and they'd barely touched the food. Instead, they kept checking their phones and glancing toward the restaurant's main entrance. Something about their behavior struck Marcus as odd, but in his line of work, you learn not to ask too many questions about what wealthy people did with their time. The man facing him was tall and thin with sharp features and cold gray eyes. He wore a Rolex that probably cost more than Marcus made in 2 years. The others called him Vincent. To his left sat a muscular man with dark hair and a scar running along his jaw. His name was Rico, and every time he moved, Marcus caught a glimpse of something bulky beneath his jacket. The third man was older, maybe in his 50s, with silver hair and an expensive suit that couldn't hide his nervous fidgeting. They called him Professor. The fourth man was the youngest, probably Marcus's age, with bleached blonde hair and tattoos creeping up from his collar. He went by Jake. Marcus approached their table with practiced professionalism, refilling water glasses and clearing the untouched plates. As he worked, he couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation. Target confirmed for 8:30, Vincent whispered, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. Exit strategy remains the same, Rico added, his hand unconsciously moving toward his jacket. Remember, clean and quiet, the professor said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. No complications. Jake nodded, bouncing his leg onto the table. What about the bodyguards? Handled, Vincent replied curtly. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard enough crime documentaries to know that this conversation wasn't about a business deal. But what could he do? Call the police and tell them four men were having a suspicious conversation? He'd sound paranoid. And worse, he'd probably lose his job. Across the restaurant, Davidson sat alone at his usual corner booth, methodically working through his dinner while reading emails on his tablet. David was a regular customer, though not in the flashy way that most of Lou Bernardine's clientele were. He was quiet, polite, and always left a generous tip. Marcus knew very little about him except that he worked in finance and seemed to prefer dining alone. What Marcus didn't know was that David Chun had built a small fortune through careful investments and an almost supernatural ability to read people. He'd grown up poor in San Francisco's Chinatown, where survival meant paying attention to details that others missed. Even now, surrounded by luxury, David's eyes constantly scanned his environment, cataloging threats and opportunities with the precision of a computer. Tonight, David's attention was divided between his tablet and the four men at table 12. He noticed them immediately when they arrived, not because of their expensive clothes or obvious wealth, but because of their body language. They moved like predators. David had seen that look before in the eyes of the gang members who used to control his childhood neighborhood. As Marcus refilled David's coffee cup, David caught his eye. "Excuse me," David said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle urgency. "Those four men at table 12. Do you know anything about them?" Marcus hesitated. Restaurant policy was strict about discussing customers, but something in David's tone made him pause. "They're not regulars," Marcus replied carefully. "Made a reservation this afternoon. Cash deposit." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Have you noticed what they're discussing?" Marcus glanced around nervously. "I shouldn't really." "I understand," David said, sliding a 20 across the table. "But I think there might be a problem. A serious one." Before Marcus could respond, the restaurant's atmosphere shifted dramatically. A buzz of excitement rippled through the dining room as the maitre d' led a small entourage to the private dining area. Marcus recognized the man immediately. Everyone in New York would have. Robert Sterling, the billionaire CEO of Sterling Industries, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Sterling was shorter than Marcus had expected from seeing him on television, but he carried himself with the confidence that came from having unlimited power and resources. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his custom suit probably cost more than most people made in 6 months. He moved through the restaurant with the casual arrogance of someone who owned the world. Behind Sterling walked 2 bodyguards, large, professional-looking men in dark suits who scanned the room with trained eyes. They took positions near the entrance to the private dining area, their presence both subtle and unmistakable. At table 12, the four men's entire demeanor changed. Vincent sat up straighter, his cold eyes tracking Sterling's movement. Rico's hand moved closer to whatever he was carrying beneath his jacket. The professor pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Jake stopped fidgeting entirely, his attention laser-focused on the billionaire. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Whatever these men were planning, Robert Sterling was the target. David Chin saw it too. The way the four men synchronized their movements, the timing of Sterling's arrival, the way they positioned themselves with clear sight lines to both the private dining area and the main exit. This wasn't coincidence. This was a carefully orchestrated plan. David's mind raced through possibilities. A kidnapping attempt? Assassination? Robbery? Whatever it was about to happen in a restaurant full of innocent people. He thought about his own daughter, safely at home with her mother, and imagined how he'd feel if she were trapped in a situation like this. Marcus was thinking the same thing. Somewhere in the Bronx, Sophia was probably already asleep, clutching the stuffed elephant he'd given her for her birthday. Jessica would be watching television, probably worrying about money and wondering when Marcus would finally find a better job. None of them knew that he was standing in the middle of what was about to become a crime scene. The restaurant continued its normal rhythm around them. Wealthy diners laughed over expensive wine. Servers moved efficiently between tables. The kitchen staff prepared elaborate dishes that would be photographed and posted on social media. Everyone was completely unaware that 4 predators were preparing to strike. Vincent checked his watch again. 8:25. Rico adjusted something beneath his jacket and stood up, stretching casually as he surveyed the room. The professor closed his laptop and placed it in a briefcase by his feet. Jake cracked his knuckles and took a deep breath. Marcus caught David's eye across the restaurant. In that moment, both men realized they were the only ones who understood what was about to happen. 2 strangers from completely different worlds, united by the terrible knowledge that they might be the only things standing between a billionaire and whatever fate these 4 men had planned for him. The question was, what could a waiter and a businessman possibly do against 4 professional criminals? The answer would define not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone in the restaurant that night. Vincent looked at his watch one final time and nodded to his companions. It was 8:30. Time to begin. Vincent's plan had taken 3 months to perfect. Every detail had been researched, every contingency considered. Robert Sterling was a creature of habit, and those habits made him predictable. Every Tuesday evening, he dined at Le Bernardin with his business partners, discussing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He always sat in the same private dining room. He always left at exactly 9:15. And he always walked to his armored Mercedes through the restaurant's side exit, where his driver waited in the narrow alley. That alley was where Vincent and his team would make their move. The plan was elegantly simple. Rico would create a distraction in the main dining room at exactly 9:10, drawing the bodyguard's attention. Jake would disable the restaurant security cameras using a device the professor had designed. The professor himself would handle any electronic surveillance from Sterling's own security team. And Vincent would be waiting in the alley with a van, ready to transport their $3 billion prize to a safe house in Queens. They weren't planning to kill Sterling. Dead billionaires couldn't access offshore bank accounts or authorize wire transfers. They wanted him alive, scared, and cooperative. The ransom demand would be modest by Sterling's standards, $50 million, less than he spent on art collection each year. A small price for a man whose net worth fluctuated by more than that amount every day the stock market was open. What Vincent hadn't counted on was Marcus Thompson's moral compass or David Chin's survival instincts. As the 4 men began moving into position, Marcus felt his heart pounding against his ribs. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding confrontation, focusing on keeping his head down and providing for his daughter. But standing here now, watching these men prepare to commit what was obviously a serious crime, he couldn't force himself to look away. Marcus thought about Sophia's favorite bedtime story, the one about the brave knight who saved the princess from the dragon. Every night, she asked him to read it again, and every night she asked the same question, "Daddy, would you be brave like the knight?" Every night, he told her yes. Tonight, he had a chance to prove it. David Chun was conducting his own risk assessment. His business success had come from making calculated decisions under pressure, and this situation demanded the same analytical approach. 4 armed men against 1 unarmed billionaire and his security team. Innocent bystanders throughout the restaurant. Multiple exit points, but limited cover. The odds were not encouraging. But David had something the 4 criminals didn't know about: military training. Before becoming a successful investor, he'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Rangers. He understood tactics, knew how to read hostile intentions, and, most importantly, he knew how to stay calm when everything was falling apart. Rico stood first, walking casually toward the restaurant's bar area. To anyone watching, he looked like a customer stretching his legs between courses. But Marcus noticed how his eyes swept the room, locating the bodyguards, the exit points, and the position of every staff member. Rico's hand remained near his jacket, and Marcus could now clearly see the outline of a weapon beneath the expensive fabric. Jake was next, pulling out what looked like a smartphone, but moving toward the restaurant's main electrical panel near the kitchen entrance. The professor remained seated, but his laptop was open again, and his fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Vincent was the last to move, excusing himself with a polite nod to the server refilling his water glass. He walked toward the restaurant's bathroom, but continued past it, heading for the side exit that led to the alley where Sterling's car would be waiting. Marcus realized he had maybe 2 minutes before whatever was about to happen would begin. He looked around desperately, searching for restaurant security, police officers, anyone in authority who could handle the situation. But Le Bernardin was an exclusive establishment that prided itself on discretion. There were no obvious security personnel, no uniformed guards, nothing but well-dressed diners and professional waitstaff. That left Marcus with an impossible choice: risk his job and possibly his life by getting involved, or stand by and watch while 4 men committed what might be a violent felony. He thought about Sophia again, about the promise he'd made to her mother to stay safe and keep providing for their family. He thought about his job, his bills, his responsibilities. And then he thought about Robert Sterling, who might be arrogant and wealthy beyond imagination, but who was still a human being with a family of his own. Marcus walked quickly to David Chen's table. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think we need to call the police." David looked up from his tablet, his expression serious but calm. "What exactly did you hear?" Marcus glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "They mentioned a target, an exit strategy, and something about bodyguards being handled. And now they're all moving into position just as Mr. Sterling is finishing his dinner." David's military training kicked in immediately. "How many exits does this restaurant have?" "3," Marcus replied. "Main entrance, kitchen service door, and the side exit that leads to the alley." "Which one does Sterling normally use?" "The side exit. His car always waits there." David nodded, his mind racing through tactical possibilities. "Where's the nearest phone you can use to call 911? "Manager's office, but it's locked." "What about your cell phone?" Marcus patted his pocket desperately. "I left it in my locker downstairs." "Restaurant policy during shifts." David pulled out his own phone, but there was no signal. Lou Bernardin's thick walls and basement location made cell reception spotty on the best of days. He cursed under his breath. "Listen carefully," David said, standing up and dropping several 20s on the table. "I need you to go to the kitchen and find a landline. Call 911 and tell them there's an imminent kidnapping attempt at this address. Tell them the target is Robert Sterling and that there are at least 4 armed suspects." "What about you?" Marcus asked. "I'm going to try to delay whatever they have planned." Marcus grabbed David's arm. "You could get killed." David met his eyes steadily. "We both could. But if we do nothing, Sterling definitely will be kidnapped, and these men will get away with it. Then they'll do it again to someone else." Marcus released his grip, understanding the weight of the choice they were making. "My daughter," he began, "has a father she can be proud of," David finished. "Go. Make the call." As Marcus hurried toward the kitchen, David began moving through the restaurant with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. His military training had taught him that the key to tactical success was controlling the initiative. Right now, Vincent and his team believed they had complete control of the situation. David's job was to disrupt that control without alerting them to his intentions. In the private dining area, Robert Sterling was finishing his dessert and checking his watch. 9:10, right on schedule. His bodyguards were positioned exactly where Vincent had expected them to be. One near the dining room entrance, one by the main restaurant exit. Both were alert, but not alarmed. This was routine for them. Jake had reached the electrical panel and was attaching a small device to the main circuit breaker. One flip of a switch would kill power to the security cameras and emergency lighting throughout the restaurant. He checked his watch. 9:12. Rico was at the bar now, ordering a drink he had no intention of consuming. From this position, he could see both bodyguards clearly. When the lights went out, he would create enough chaos to draw them away from Sterling. He'd done this kind of work before, and he knew that even professional security could be manipulated if you understood human psychology. The professor was monitoring Sterling Industries' security communications through his laptop, watching for any sign that their plan had been detected. Everything appeared normal. Sterling's security team was relaxed, following their standard Tuesday night protocols. In the alley, Vincent sat in the driver's seat of a stolen van, engine running, listening to his team's progress through a discreet earpiece. In 90 seconds, Robert Sterling would walk out of that side exit and into the biggest mistake of his life. What Vincent didn't know was that Marcus had reached the kitchen and was frantically explaining the situation to a confused line cook who spoke limited English. What he didn't know was that David Chun was moving through the restaurant like a ghost, using his military training to position himself where he could do the most damage to their carefully laid plans. And what none of them knew was that Robert Sterling had just received an urgent phone call that would change everything. Sterling's phone buzzed at 9:13. The caller ID showed his head of security, a man who never called during dinner unless there was a genuine emergency. "Sir," the voice was tense professional. "We've received an anonymous tip about a possible threat at your current location. I need you to remain exactly where you are while we sweep the building." Sterling felt his blood pressure spike. "What kind of threat?" "Kidnapping attempt, sir. Multiple suspects. We're bringing additional teams to your location now." "How long?" Sterling asked, already motioning to his dinner companions that something was wrong. 10 minutes maximum. Do not leave the dining room under any circumstances." At 9:14, Jake flipped the switch. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in 30 seconds later, bathing the restaurant in an eerie red glow. Customers began murmuring in confusion. Servers stopped mid-stride, trying to understand what had happened. Rico moved immediately, accidentally bumping into a waiter carrying a tray of expensive wine glasses. The crash echoed through the dining room like an explosion. Both bodyguards turned toward the sound, their training kicking in as they moved to investigate the disturbance. But Robert Sterling didn't move toward the side exit as planned. Instead, he remained in his chair, surrounded by his dinner companions, waiting for his security team's all clear. Vincent waited in the alley, checking his watch as the seconds ticked by. 9:15 came and went. Then 9:16. Then 9:17. Something was wrong. In the chaos of the darkened restaurant, David Chun moved like a professional. He'd spent months in urban combat zones, and this felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. He could see Rico near the bar, trying to create more confusion. He could see Jake moving back toward his table, probably planning to rejoin his team now that the cameras were down. But David had spotted something the criminals had missed: additional security personnel entering through the main restaurant entrance. Sterling's people were taking the anonymous tip seriously. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, his face flushed with adrenaline and fear. He'd finally reached the police, but the dispatcher had told him units were already en route to the restaurant. Someone else had called first. In the red-lit confusion of the restaurant, Marcus caught sight of Rico pulling something from his jacket. In the emergency lighting, the metal gleamed like a promise of violence. That was when Marcus Thompson, the waiter and single father who just wanted to provide for his daughter, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't think about the consequences. He didn't calculate the odds. He certainly didn't consider himself a hero. He just acted. Marcus moved without thinking, his body acting on pure instinct as he saw Rico's hand emerge from his jacket gripping a black pistol. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and in that moment, Marcus felt like he was moving through a nightmare where every second stretched into eternity. Rico was turning towards Sterling's bodyguards, probably planning to neutralize them before they could respond to the crisis. His finger was moving toward the trigger when Marcus crashed into him with the full force of his 170 pounds. The impact sent both men sprawling across the marble floor. Rico's weapon skittered away into the darkness under a nearby table. Marcus had never been in a real fight in his life. Playground scuffles in elementary school didn't count, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Rico recovered first, his professional training kicking in. He rolled away from Marcus and came up in a combat stance, his hand reaching for a backup weapon strapped to his ankle. But Marcus wasn't done. He grabbed a heavy wine bottle from a nearby table and swung it with all the force he could muster. The bottle connected with Rico's shoulder, spinning him around and buying Marcus precious seconds to scramble toward the gun that had disappeared under the table. Across the restaurant, chaos was erupting as customers finally began to understand that something serious was happening. Screams echoed through the dining room as people dove under tables or ran toward the exits. Servers abandoned their stations, some trying to help customers evacuate while others simply fled in terror. David Chun was moving through the confusion with military precision, using the panicking crowd as cover while he tracked Jake's movement toward the electrical panel. If Jake could restore the main lighting and disable the emergency systems, Vincent's team would regain the advantage. David reached Jake just as the young man was attempting to reverse his sabotage of the electrical system. Jake was focused entirely on the complex wiring, completely unaware of David's approach until it was too late. David's military hand-to-hand combat training took over. A precise strike to Jake's solar plexus doubled him over, gasping for breath. Before Jake could recover, David had him in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain. Jake struggled for maybe 10 seconds before going limp. David quickly zip-tied Jake's hands with a cable tie from his pocket, a habit from his military days when being prepared for anything had meant the difference between life and death. Then, he turned his attention to the electrical panel, using Jake's own tools to restore power to the security cameras and main lighting. The restaurant suddenly blazed with normal illumination, revealing the full scope of the chaos. Customers were huddled under tables, servers were pressed against walls, and broken glass covered the floor near where Marcus and Rico had fought. Marcus had managed to retrieve Rico's pistol and was now pointing it at the criminal with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. He'd never held a gun before in his life, and the weight of it felt impossible in his grip. Rico was back on his feet, his shoulder obviously injured, but his eyes still cold and calculating. He could see that Marcus was terrified, amateur, completely out of his depth. All Rico had to do was wait for the right moment to disarm him. "You don't know what you're doing, kid," Rico said, his voice calm despite the blood trickling from his mouth. "You're going to get yourself killed." Marcus's hands trembled, but he kept the gun pointed at Rico's chest. "Stay back. The police are coming. Even if they are, you think you're going to shoot me?" Rico took a small step forward. "You think you have what it takes to pull that trigger?" Marcus didn't answer, but Rico could see the doubt in his eyes. The criminal had spent years reading people, understanding their weaknesses, exploiting their fears. This waiter was brave, but not a killer. That made him predictable. What Rico couldn't see was Sterling's additional security personnel moving through the restaurant, professional soldiers who had been alerted by the anonymous tip and were now treating this as an active threat situation. Vincent's voice crackled through Rico's earpiece, furious and desperate. "What the hell is happening in there?" "Sterling hasn't come out. Police sirens are approaching from 3 directions." The professor was frantically packing his equipment, realizing that their carefully planned operation had become a disaster. Jake wasn't responding to radio calls, the lighting was back on, and from his position near the kitchen, he could see armed men in tactical gear entering the restaurant. In the alley, Vincent faced an impossible choice. He could abandon his team and flee while he still had a chance, or he could enter the restaurant and try to salvage their mission. The rational choice was obvious: cut losses and run. But Vincent had spent 3 months planning this operation, and the thought of walking away empty-handed made his blood boil. He made the wrong choice. Vincent burst through the side entrance just as Sterling's security team was establishing a perimeter around the private dining area. The Billionaire was now surrounded by 4 heavily armed professionals who had turned the elegant dining room into a fortress. Vincent's entry triggered immediate action from his security team. Years of training kicked in as they identified him as a threat and moved to neutralize him. Vincent managed to draw his weapon, but he was outnumbered 4-1 by men who did this for a living. The firefight lasted maybe 15 seconds. When it was over, Vincent was face down on the marble floor with 2 bullets in his chest and the taste of his own blood in his mouth. He was still alive, but barely, and he knew with crystalline clarity that his criminal career was finished. Back near the bar, Rico was still trying to manipulate Marcus into lowering the gun. He'd move closer, close enough to strike if the waiter's attention wavered for even a second. "Think about your family," Rico said, his voice almost hypnotic. "Think about your daughter. You think she wants to grow up with a father in prison for murder?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sophia's face flashed through his mind, her smile when he came home from work, her excitement when he read her bedtime stories, her innocent question about whether he would be brave like the night in her favorite book. Rico saw the hesitation and moved. He lunged forward, reaching for the gun in Marcus's trembling hands. For a moment, the two men struggled for control of the weapon, Marcus's fear battling against Rico's experience and determination. That was when David Shin arrived. David had secured Jake and restored the electrical systems, but he could hear the confrontation near the bar and knew that Marcus was in trouble. He approached from Rico's blind spot, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. Rico never saw David coming. One moment, he was wrestling for control of the gun, confident that his superior training would win out over the waiter's desperation. The next moment, David's arm was around his throat, applying pressure to the carotid arteries with surgical precision. Rico tried to fight back, but David's grip was unbreakable. Within seconds, the criminal's struggles grew weaker. Within 10 seconds, he was unconscious. Marcus staggered backward, still holding the pistol, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and shock. David gently took the weapon from his hands and engaged the safety. "It's over," David said quietly. "You did good." Police sirens were getting louder now, and Marcus could hear boots on marble as Sterling's security team secured the restaurant. In the distance, the professor was being tackled by two men in tactical gear who had caught him trying to escape through the kitchen. Marcus sank into a nearby chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. The reality of what had just happened was hitting him like a freight train. He'd attacked an armed criminal. He'd held a gun on another human being. He'd helped prevent what could have been a kidnapping or worse. "My daughter," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if something had happened to me? What would she do?" David sat down beside him, understanding exactly what the younger man was going through. "You made a choice," he said. "A hard choice, but it was the right one." "How do you know?" David thought about his own daughter, safe at home with her mother, probably doing homework or watching television. Because sometimes being a good father means showing your children what courage looks like, even when you're scared out of your mind. Robert Sterling emerged from the private dining area, surrounded by his security detail. The billionaire looked shaken, but unharmed. He surveyed the scene: broken glass, overturned tables, 3 criminals in handcuffs, and 2 ordinary men who had risked everything to protect a stranger. Sterling approached Marcus and David slowly, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "I understand you two saved my life tonight," Sterling said, extending his hand to Marcus first, then to David. Marcus was too overwhelmed to respond, but David shook Sterling's hand firmly. "Anyone would have done the same thing," David said. Sterling looked around at the other restaurant patrons, many of whom were still hiding under tables or had fled the building entirely. "No," he said quietly. "They wouldn't have." Police officers were flooding into the restaurant now, securing the scene and beginning the complex process of sorting out exactly what had happened. Marcus and David would spend the next 6 hours giving statements, explaining their actions, and trying to make sense of a night that had changed all of their lives forever. But as Marcus sat there, still shaking from adrenaline and fear, he thought about the question Sophia asked him every night. "Daddy, would you be brave like the night?" For the first time in his life, he knew the answer was yes, even if he never wanted to prove it again. The police station at 3 in the morning felt like a different planet from the elegant restaurant where Marcus had started his evening. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on worn linoleum floors. The coffee was terrible, the chairs were uncomfortable, and Detective Sarah Morrison had been asking the same questions for hours. Marcus sat across from her in interview room 2, still wearing his waiter's uniform, now stained with wine and blood from his struggle with Rico. His hands had finally stopped shaking, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rico's face and felt the weight of the gun in his trembling grip. "Let's go through it one more time," Detective Morrison said, her voice patient but tired. She was in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of steady presence that came from 20 years of dealing with violent crime. "You overheard the conversation at table 12. What exactly made you think they were planning a crime?" Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. They were talking about targets and exit strategies. When Mr. Sterling arrived, they all changed. It was like watching predators spot prey. "But you didn't call police immediately?" "I tried to. I want to find a phone, but Mr. Chun said we needed to act fast. There wasn't time." Detective Morrison made another note in her file. Marcus had been telling the same story for hours, and every detail remained consistent. Either he was telling the truth, or he was one of the best liars she'd ever encountered. Given that he was a single father who worked double shifts to support his daughter, she was leaning toward the truth. In interview room 3, David Chun was going through the same process with Detective James Rodriguez. David's military background made him a more practiced witness. His account was precise, detailed, and delivered with the kind of calm professionalism that cops appreciated. "Your service record shows 2 tours in Afghanistan," Rodriguez said, reading from a file. "Ranger Battalion. Silver Star for gallantry in action. That explains how you handled Jake so efficiently." David nodded. "The situation required immediate action. I assessed the threat and responded accordingly. Most civilians would have run for the exits. I'm not most civilians." Rodriguez studied David's face, trying to read the man behind the military bearing. "What made you get involved? You could have left the restaurant. You could have kept your head down and let someone else handle it." David was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question. "I have a daughter," he finally said. "She's 8 years old. If something happened to me, she'd still have her mother, good life opportunities. But Marcus Thompson has a 6-year-old daughter who depends on him completely. If he'd been killed trying to stop those men alone." He didn't finish the sentence, but Rodriguez understood. Sometimes heroism wasn't about being fearless. Sometimes it was about protecting someone else's chance to be a parent. Down the hall, Robert Sterling was giving his own statement to Detective Morrison's supervisor, Lieutenant Patrick Kowalski. Sterling had spent the hours since the incident making phone calls to his lawyers, his security chief, and his public relations team. The attempted kidnapping would be front-page news within hours, and Sterling Industries' stock price would probably take a hit when markets opened. But for once in his life, Sterling found that he didn't care about the financial implications. "I want to do something for those 2 men," Sterling told Kowalski. "They risked their lives for a complete stranger." Kowalski nodded. "That's your business, Mr. Sterling. Though I'd recommend waiting until the investigation is complete." "How long will that take?" "Depends on how cooperative the suspects are. The one called Vincent is in surgery. Might not make it. Rico's awake, but not talking. Jake's scared enough that he might flip. The professor's demanding a lawyer." Sterling thought about Vincent, fighting for his life in a hospital bed just a few miles away. 3 months ago, that man had been planning Sterling's kidnapping. Tonight, he might die because of those plans. The irony wasn't lost on Sterling, but he felt no satisfaction in it. At 4:30 in the morning, Marcus finally called Jessica to explain why he wouldn't be coming home. The conversation was difficult. "How do you tell your ex-wife that you spent the evening stopping armed criminals without sounding like you'd lost your mind?" "Are you hurt?" Jessica asked, her voice tight with worry. "No, I'm fine. Scared, but fine." "Marcus, what were you thinking? You could have been killed." Marcus looked around the police station at the detectives and officers who dealt with this kind of violence every day, at David Chun sitting calmly in the hallway reading emails on his phone as if nothing unusual had happened. "I was thinking about Sophia," Marcus said, "about what kind of father I want to be." There was silence on the other end of the line. "The man they were planning to hurt," Marcus continued, "he has a family too. Kids who love him. If I just stood there and watched." "I understand," Jessica said quietly. "I'm proud of you. Scared out of my mind, but proud." After hanging up, Marcus found himself sitting next to David in the station's main hallway. both men too wired to sleep despite their exhaustion. "Do you regret it?" Marcus asked. David considered the question. "I regret that it was necessary. But no, I don't regret our actions. I keep thinking about Sophia. What if Rico had gotten that gun away from me? What if he'd shot me? She'd grow up without a father because I decided to play hero." David understood the internal conflict. Every soldier dealt with it. The tension between duty and self-preservation, between protecting others and protecting your own family. "My daughter Emma is 8, David said. She's starting to ask questions about what I did in the military, why I have nightmares sometimes, what it means to serve your country. I've been struggling with how to answer those questions." He paused, watching police officers move through the station with practiced efficiency. "Tonight gave me an answer. I can tell her that sometimes, when you see something wrong happening, you have a choice. You can look the other way and stay safe, or you can step forward and do what's right, even when it's dangerous. The choice you make in that moment defines who you are." Marcus thought about Sophia's bedtime story, about the brave knight who saved the princess from the dragon. "She's going to want to hear about this," Marcus said. "When she's older, she's going to want to know what really happened." "What will you tell her?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. That her father wasn't the bravest person in the world. But when it mattered, when someone needed help, he tried to do the right thing. At 5:15, Detective Morrison emerged from interview room 2 with a cup of coffee and a tired smile. "Gentlemen, you're free to go. We'll need you to come back in a few days for follow-up interviews. But for now, you've done enough." Marcus stood up, his legs stiff from hours of sitting. "What happens to the men we caught? That depends on a lot of factors. But based on what we found in their van, restraints, drugs, untraceable phones, this wasn't their first rodeo. Vincent and his crew are looking at federal kidnapping charges, conspiracy, weapons violations. They're going away for a very long time." David gathered his belongings and prepared to leave. "Detective, can I ask you something? How often do ordinary citizens get involved in situations like this?" Morrison smiled ruefully. "Almost never. Most people freeze up or run away, which is usually the smart thing to do. What you two did tonight." She shook her head. "I've been a cop for 20 years, and I've seen maybe 5 cases where civilians risk themselves to help strangers the way you did." As they walked out of the police station into the gray dawn of a Manhattan morning, Marcus felt the weight of exhaustion settling over him like a blanket. His shift at Le Bernardin had ended 12 hours ago, but it felt like a different lifetime. David offered to give him a ride home, and Marcus gratefully accepted. As they drove through the empty streets toward the Bronx, both men were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about the night that had changed everything. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. He looked at the screen and saw a photo from Jessica, Sophia asleep in her bed, clutching her stuffed elephant, completely unaware that her father had become a hero while she dreamed. Tomorrow, Marcus would have to figure out how to go back to work, how to serve tables and smile at customers and pretend that nothing had changed. Tomorrow, he'd have to deal with reporters who would want to interview him, lawyers who would want statements, and the reality that his quiet life was about to become very public. But right now, driving through the empty city toward his sleeping daughter, Marcus Thompson felt something he'd never experienced before. He felt proud of who he was. The knight in Sophia's story wasn't brave because he wasn't afraid. He was brave because he was afraid and acted anyway. Tonight, Marcus had learned the difference. And tomorrow, when Sophia asked him if he would be brave like the knight, he would have a new answer. He would tell her about the knight he already was. 3 weeks after the incident at Le Bernardin, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in the lobby of Sterling Industries, wearing the only suit he owned and feeling completely out of place among the marble columns and crystal chandeliers. The building stretched 47 floors above Manhattan, each floor representing millions of dollars in pharmaceutical research, global operations, and corporate power. Marcus had been here once before, the morning after the kidnapping attempt, when Robert Sterling's assistant had called to invite him to a private meeting. That first visit had been surreal. Sitting in a conference room that was larger than his entire apartment, listening to Sterling offer him a reward that amounted to more money than Marcus made in 3 years. He turned it down. The decision had shocked everyone, including Marcus himself. But taking money for doing the right thing felt wrong somehow, like it would cheapen what had happened that night. Sterling had seemed genuinely surprised by the refusal, and Marcus had thought that would be the end of it. He'd been wrong. David Chun was already waiting in the lobby, looking perfectly comfortable in an expensive gray suit and reading the Wall Street Journal as if corporate headquarters were his natural habitat. When he saw Marcus, he stood and extended his hand with the same calm professionalism that had characterized everything about him since that night at the restaurant. "How are you holding up?" David asked. Marcus managed a nervous smile. "Still trying to figure out why we're here. Mr. Sterling's assistant wouldn't tell me anything except that it was important." David folded his newspaper neatly. Robert Sterling didn't build a $3 billion company by accepting no for an answer. When you refused his reward, you probably just convinced him that he needed to try harder. The elevator ride to Sterling's office took forever, rising through floor after floor of laboratories, conference rooms, and executive suites. Marcus watched the numbers climb and thought about how much his life had changed in just 3 weeks. The media attention had been intense, but brief. For 72 hours, Marcus and David had been front-page news, the heroes of Luke Bernardine, who had stopped a kidnapping attempt through courage and quick thinking. Reporters had camped outside Marcus's apartment building, wanting interviews and photos. His phone had rung constantly with calls from producers wanting him to appear on talk shows. Marcus had declined all of it. He'd returned to work at Luke Bernardine after 3 days, serving tables and trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Customers recognized him now, pointing and whispering. Some left bigger tips. Others seemed uncomfortable being served by someone who'd been involved in violence, even as a hero. The restaurant's management had been supportive, but cautious. They appreciated the positive publicity Marcus had brought to Lou Bernardine, but they also worried about future incidents. High-profile employees could be targets for criminals or attention seekers. Marcus understood their concerns, but it still hurt. For 8 months, Luke Bernardine had been his professional home. Now, he felt like a curiosity, something to be managed rather than simply employed. David's experience had been different. His investment firm had embraced the publicity, using his heroism as a marketing tool to attract new clients. When your money manager has proven he'll risk his life to do what's right, you can trust him with your portfolio had become their unofficial slogan. David found the commercialization distasteful, but effective. His business had grown significantly since the incident. Sterling's office occupied the entire 47th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan. The billionaire was waiting for them behind a desk that probably cost more than Marcus's car, but he stood and walked around it when they entered, greeting both men with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming," Sterling said, gesturing toward a seating area with leather chairs that looked like they belonged in a private club. "I know you're both busy, but I have a proposition that I think might interest you." Marcus and David took seats across from Sterling, who seemed different somehow from the night of the attack. Less formal, more human. The near-death experience had clearly affected him, though he carried himself with the same confidence that had built his empire. "First," Sterling began, "I want you to know that Vincent died 2 days ago. Complications from his surgery. The other 3 are cooperating with federal investigators and will likely plead guilty to conspiracy and attempted kidnapping. They're looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions at the news. Relief that the threat was permanently over, but also sadness that a human being had died, even one who had tried to hurt others. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what you did that night saved my life," Sterling continued. "Not metaphorically, literally. Vincent's team had planned to hold me for weeks while they accessed my offshore accounts. Based on their history, and they had a history, I probably wouldn't have survived the experience." David leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Sterling, we appreciate your gratitude, but as I told you before, we don't need rewards for doing what anyone should have done." Sterling smiled. "That's exactly why I want to offer you something different. Not a reward, but an opportunity." He turned to Marcus first. I've been thinking about what happened at the restaurant, about how your moral courage prevented a tragedy. That kind of instinct, that kind of character is exactly what my company needs in its security division. Marcus felt his heart skip. Sir, I'm offering you a position as Director of Personal Security. You'd be responsible for protecting executives, identifying threats, coordinating with law enforcement. It would mean training, education, a salary that's probably 10 times what you make at Le Bernardin. More importantly, it would mean using your natural instincts to help people. Marcus was speechless. A year ago, he'd been struggling to make rent on his one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. Now he was being offered a six-figure job with one of the world's largest corporations. Sterling turned to David. And I have a different proposition for you. Sterling Industries has been looking for someone to head our new charitable foundation. We're planning to invest $1 billion over the next 5 years in programs that help single parents, military veterans, and other people who need support, but often don't get it. David raised an eyebrow. You want me to give up my investment business to run a charity? I want you to use your financial expertise and your understanding of what courage really means to help people who remind me of the two of you, Sterling replied. People who do the right thing even when it's difficult. People who put others before themselves. People who make the world better just by being in it. Marcus found his voice. Mr. Sterling, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified for a position like that. I'm a waiter. I didn't even finish college. Marcus, Sterling said gently, you tackled an armed criminal to protect a complete stranger. You held a gun on a man twice your size because you knew it was right, even though you were terrified. Do you really think I care about your college transcripts? But I don't know anything about security work. You know about paying attention to details. You know about reading people's intentions. You know about making hard choices under pressure. Everything else can be taught. David was considering Sterling's offer with the same analytical approach he brought to investment decisions. The foundation would have $1 billion budget. To start, more if we can prove it's effective. And complete autonomy to decide how it's spent. Complete autonomy. I'd want quarterly reports, but the day-to-day decisions would be entirely yours. David was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Emma and what kind of world he wanted her to grow up in. Can I ask why you're doing this? Really? Sterling walked to the window, looking out over the city where millions of people lived and worked and struggled with their own challenges. I've been wealthy for most of my adult life, he said. I've built companies, made more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, bought everything I ever wanted. But 3 weeks ago, I came closer to death than I ever have before, and it was prevented by two men who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by getting involved. He turned back to face them. That night taught me something about the difference between having power and using it well. You too have something that all my money can't buy. The instinct to protect others, even at personal cost. I want to surround myself with people like that. I want to build something that matters, not just something that's profitable. Marcus thought about Sophia, about the bedtime stories, and the questions about bravery and what it meant to be a good person. He thought about the bills on his kitchen counter and the stress of working double shifts just to make ends meet. He thought about the future he wanted to build for his daughter. If I took this job, Marcus said slowly, would I still be able to be a good father? Would I still be home for bedtime stories? Sterling smiled. Marcus, the whole point is to help you be a better father. Better hours, better pay, work that matters. Your daughter should be proud of what her father does for a living. David made his decision first. I'll do it, but I have conditions. The foundation has to focus on people who are trying to help themselves, not just charity for charity's sake. And we fund programs that teach people to be self-sufficient, not dependent. Agreed. David turned to Marcus. You should take it too. Do you know what you did that night? You saw something wrong and fixed it. That's exactly what security work is, preventing problems before they happen. Marcus took a deep breath. Can I maybe start part-time? Keep working at the restaurant until I'm sure I can do the job. You can start however you're comfortable, Sterling said. But Marcus, I'm confident you can do this job. You've already proven you have the most important qualification, which is you care more about protecting innocent people than you care about your own safety. Everything else is just training. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in his new office on the 32nd floor of Sterling Industries, looking out at a view of Central Park and talking to his daughter on the phone. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Sophia asked, her voice bright with 6-year-old enthusiasm. "I'll be there in an hour, sweetheart. Just finishing up some paperwork. Will you read me the night story tonight?" Marcus smiled. "Of course. But, Sophia, can I tell you a secret?" "What?" "The knight in that story? He's not the only brave person in the world. There are brave people everywhere doing brave things every day. Like you, Daddy." Marcus looked around his office, at the certificates from security training courses, at the photos of corporate executives he was responsible for protecting, at the plaque on his desk that read, "Director of Personal Security." "Like lots of people, sweetheart. Like your mom, who works hard every day to take care of you. Like Mr. Chun, who uses his job to help families like ours. Like all the people who try to make the world a little bit better." Is Mr. Chun really brave, too? Marcus thought about David, who had taken his new position as head of the Sterling Foundation and turned it into one of the most effective charitable organizations in the country. In 6 months, they'd helped fund job training programs for single parents, mental health services for veterans, and educational scholarships for kids like Sophia, who came from families that struggled financially. "Yes, honey, he's very brave. Different from the knight in your story, but brave in his own way." After hanging up, Marcus gathered his things and prepared to head home. Tomorrow he'd be flying to Los Angeles with Robert Sterling for a corporate event, part of his ongoing responsibilities as Sterling's head of security. It was work he'd learned to love, protecting people, preventing problems, using his instincts to keep others safe. But tonight, he was just a father going home to read bedtime stories to his daughter. As he waited for the elevator, Marcus thought about the night that had changed everything. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years ago, when he'd been a struggling waiter who worried about paying rent and wondered if he was a good enough father. He still wondered about being a good enough father. But now he had a different kind of answer. He was trying every day to be someone his daughter could be proud of. Not perfect, not fearless, but someone who cared about others and tried to do the right thing, even when it was scary. Someone who understood that being brave didn't mean you weren't afraid. It meant you were afraid and acted anyway. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped inside and pushed the button for the lobby, heading home to his daughter and the life they were building together. He was still just a waiter who'd gotten lucky. But now he was a waiter who'd gotten lucky and learned what it meant to be a hero. And that, Marcus thought as the elevator descended toward the street level, was enough for anyone.